On March 27th of 1945, Operation Starvation started. Operation Starvation was an American attack on the Japanese ports and shipping process, and it was super important in part because Japan was at a 20% calorie deficit, right? So Japan imported 20% of its food, and it didn't have that food available to feed its people if the food stopped coming in and out of the ports. For comparison, the United States is currently at about a 13% economic deficit when it comes to food, but that is mostly because we export food at rates that are, we export food that is cheaper and we import food that is more expensive. So we import about 60% of our fruit and our nuts, but we make enough food to feed all of the United States. Now, that does not mean that we are not susceptible to infrastructure problems when it comes to food, right? It means that like California and Texas and the Midwest make enough food calorie-wise to feed the United States. It does not mean that highways and trains are not necessary as part of that. So when I say the United States is not at a calorie deficit, understand that I am not saying that the United States is not susceptible to problems of supply chain and food at all. What I'm saying is that Japan had a clear calorie deficit of about 20%. And we see what happens to supply chains when we see what happens in Operation Starvation. So Operation Starvation starts because a bunch of people started trialing using these mines. What they would do is they drop bombs out of airplanes into the water that had mines that didn't initially explode. They waited, the fuse was either a magnet or a acoustic fuse or a pressure fuse. They would wait in the water, the boat would come over them, the ship, and it would explode, right? And Great Britain and Australia trialed some of them. This guy named Admiral Thomas Kincaid. Admiral Thomas Kincaid, not the lighthouse painter of the 1990s, the World War II admiral, was 100% convinced that this was the path, right? He had researched it, and he came forward and said that these mining campaigns had 100 times as much destruction as similar plane to land bombing campaigns, that they were 100 times more effective. And eventually, General Curtis LeMay comes in, and he orders Operation Starvation. Now, that's interesting because Curtis LeMay is the same general that brought us the Tokyo fire bombings, right? So he ordered multiple things happening, and one of those things was the Tokyo fire bombings, which were low-level, civilian-oriented, late at night, cloud cover fire bombings of parts of Japan in Tokyo. And they were controversial, to say the least. There were huge civilian casualties, right? But he also ordered Operation Starvation, and Operation Starvation had like all the casualties related to Operation Starvation were either people on military ships or people that were like in ships doing transporting, right? Doesn't mean they're not civilian targets in some ways, but it does mean that it's a different kind of warfare than low-level at-night firebombing. And it cuts off the supply, which puts the pressure on the government to ultimately surrender, right? And it is incredibly effective. There's 5 stages of the campaign. Over this campaign, they drop about 12,000 bombs, and they destroy 670 ships, right? They destroyed something like 60% of the tonnage of shipping that was coming in and out of Japan, right? The military shipping. They cut off food supplies, they cut off material supplies, and ultimately it was part of what put so much pressure on Japan that Japan ultimately surrendered, right? And it's a story about kind of the warfare technique And it also is this story about the importance of those food supply chains and knowing where those calories are going to come from to feed people, and understanding that all of our supply chains are these like delicate little beasts, right? They're little spider webs, and when you tug on one, you tug on the other. And right now, our food chains in the United States are different, but we are definitely relying on all of this transportation to happen to bring us food. And we're relying on outside of the United States to bring us the fruits and nuts and other kind of higher quality imports. And we have to know what that is and what vulnerabilities exist there in order to understand where we currently exist. March 27th, Operation Starvation.